Stand at the base of a coast redwood and you will feel something ancient looking back at you. Not metaphorically, literally. The tree you're standing beneath germinated when Rome was still a kingdom. It pushed through soil while Babylon fell. It added rings through the rise of Greece, the birth of Christ, the collapse of empires you've never heard of. And it kept growing. 3,000 years of uninterrupted life, stretching 350 feet into the coastal fog. A trunk 35 feet across, bark a foot thick. A living thing so massive that when you press your hand against it, you cannot feel the other side. You cannot comprehend the other side. And in the late 1800s, men looked at these trees and thought, we need to cut that down. Not small men, not stupid men. Men with families and mortgages and genuine skill who woke up every morning, grabbed a crosscut saw that couldn't even reach the center of what they were cutting, and spent 2 weeks turning a 3,000-year-old organism into lumber. This is the story of how they did it. The techniques that sound impossible, the tools that weren't designed for trees this big, and the systematic destruction that erased 96% of the original old-growth redwoods from the face of the earth. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how two men with hand tools felled trees wider than a house. You'll know why they had to drill through the heartwood from both sides just to make a cut. And you'll feel the ground shake from 2 miles away as something that took 3 millennia to build came crashing down in seconds. This is old-growth redwood logging, and nothing about it was clean. Before we talk about how they cut these trees, you need to understand what they were cutting. The coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, is not simply a large tree. It is a biological anomaly, a living thing that defies the normal limits of what organic material can achieve. Picture the tallest building in your town. Now picture it made of wood. Now picture it alive, breathing, pulling water from the ground to its crown through nothing but capillary action and cellular pressure. That's a mature coast redwood. The largest specimens reached heights exceeding 350 feet. Their trunks stretched 35 feet in diameter, sometimes more. If you laid one flat, you could drive a stagecoach through the hollow of its base. Some loggers did exactly that for photographs, standing inside the trunk with their teams of oxen, grinning at the camera while surrounded by wood that had been growing since the Bronze Age. But height and width don't capture what made these trees different. Age did. When loggers in Humboldt County felled an old-growth redwood in 1890, they weren't killing something that had lived for a few centuries. They were ending something that had been alive for 3,000 years, trees that germinated around 1000 BCE, trees that were already ancient when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, trees that had survived every fire, every drought, every flood that California could throw at them for 30 centuries. The rings inside these trunks recorded everything. Every wet year showed as a wide band of growth, and every drought compressed into a thin, dark line. Fire scars appeared as black crescents, healed over by subsequent growth but never forgotten. You could read climate data from the time of King David in the wood of a single tree. You could trace the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age, the volcanic winters that followed eruptions on the other side of the planet. And when that tree hit the ground, all that data ended. All that history became lumber. Before European contact, old-growth coast redwoods covered approximately 2 million acres of California's northern coast. From Big Sur to the Oregon border, a belt of ancient forest ran along the fog line, where the marine air kept the trees hydrated and protected from wildfire. The fog was essential. It provided moisture during the dry summers when rain didn't fall for months. And it kept temperatures moderate, preventing the heat that would have killed seedlings and stressed mature trees. Humboldt County and Del Norte County sat at the heart of this belt. The forest here held the largest, oldest, most magnificent specimens on Earth. Trees that had never been touched by human tools. Trees that most human beings could not have reached with any tool available to them. The terrain was brutal, all steep canyons and sudden ridges, covered in undergrowth that could stop a man dead after 100 yards. The Yurok and other native peoples had lived among these trees for thousands of years without threatening them. They used fallen wood. They harvested bark from living trees in ways that didn't kill them. They understood what they had, and they treated it with something approaching reverence. And then the gold rush ended, the timber rush began, and men with crosscut saws showed up in numbers that the forest could not survive. The loggers who cut old-growth redwoods were not the villains of this story. That framing is too simple and too cruel to men who were often immigrants, often poor, and almost always doing work that would kill or maim a significant percentage of their crews. They came from Scandinavia, from Portugal, from the American South. They came from the lumber camps of Michigan and Wisconsin, where the white pine had already been cut out, where entire forests had been reduced to stumps and slash in a single generation. They came because the pay was better than farming, better than mining, better than most things a man with a strong back and no formal education could do in 1880s California. A skilled faller, yeah, the man who actually cut the tree down, could earn $3 to $4 a day. That was serious money. Unskilled labor paid $1 or less. A faller could save enough in a few years to buy land, start a business, bring family over from the old country. It was also the most dangerous job in the most dangerous industry in America. Logging in the redwoods had a fatality rate that would shut down any modern operation instantly. Men died from falling branches, called widowmakers because of their tendency to drop without warning and crush whoever stood beneath. These weren't small branches. On an old-growth redwood, a branch might be 3 feet in diameter and weigh tons. When it fell, it killed. Men died when trees fell the wrong direction. A constant risk with trunks so massive that internal rot could shift the center of gravity in ways no one could predict. You could do everything right, cut the notch perfectly, saw the back cut at exactly the proper angle, and the tree would still twist on its stump and fall sideways, crushing anyone who had guessed wrong about where to run. Men died from infections in an age before antibiotics, when a small cut could become septic and kill you in a week. They died from drowning during river drives, when the logs they were guiding downstream jammed up and broke loose without warning. They died from equipment failures that sent 1,000-pound logs rolling over anyone in their path. And unlike modern loggers, these men worked with hand tools. No chainsaws, no hydraulic jacks, no mechanical wedges. No safety equipment beyond a felt hat and maybe a pair of leather gloves. 2 men. 1 crosscut saw, a set of axes, springboards, wedges, and time. A single tree might take 2 weeks to fell, 2 weeks of sawing by hand, 8 to 10 hours a day, on a platform 20 feet off the ground, while rain dripped down your neck and fog made everything slick and dangerous. The logging camps where these men lived were studies in organized misery. Bunkhouses held 40 or 50 men, sleeping on wooden bunks stacked 3 high, separated by aisles too narrow for 2 men to pass. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, wet wool, drying boots, and the kerosene lamps that provided the only light after sunset. A camp cook fed the crews. The food was substantial but monotonous. Beans, salt pork, biscuits. Coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon. Occasionally fresh meat when someone shot a deer, but mostly preserved food that could survive the trip into the backcountry without refrigeration. The men ate in silence, shoveling calories into bodies that burned 3,000 or 4,000 a day. Conversation was for after dinner in the bunkhouse, when men played cards or read newspapers that were weeks out of date or simply collapsed onto their bunks and waited for sleep. They woke at dawn, ate again, and walked to the cut. Sometimes the cut was miles from camp, and they hiked through darkness with lanterns, following trails they'd cut themselves through the undergrowth. They worked until the light failed, ate dinner, and did it again the next day, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. What if a tree was almost down, and leaving it overnight seemed too risky? This was the rhythm of their lives. Cut, eat, sleep, cut, eat, sleep. Until the forest around the camp was gone and they moved to the next site, taking down their bunkhouses and reassembling them somewhere else, always moving deeper into the old growth, always following the big trees. The men who did this work were not destroying nature out of malice. They were feeding families. They were building a country. And they were using skills that took years to develop, skills that most people today could not replicate even with coaching and practice. This does not make what happened acceptable. It makes it comprehensible. And comprehensibility matters because romanticizing these men as folk heroes is just as dishonest as dismissing them as environmental criminals. They were workers, they were craftsmen, and they were part of a system that liquidated 96% of an irreplaceable ecosystem in less than a century. Now, the tools. A crosscut saw in the 1880s was a beautiful piece of engineering. A blade of high carbon steel, 6 to 12 feet long, with teeth designed to cut across the grain of wood rather than with it. 2 handles, one on each end. 2 men, one on each side, pulling the blade back and forth in rhythm. The teeth came in sets, alternating between cutting teeth that scored the wood and raker teeth that cleared the sawdust from the kerf. Keeping these teeth sharp and properly set was an art in itself. A good saw filer could make a blade sing through wood. A bad one could make the same blade bind and stick and exhaust the sawyers in half the time. On a normal tree, a crosscut saw worked exactly as designed. You cut a notch on one side to control the direction of the fall, the undercut, angled so the tree would hinge toward the notch as it tipped. Then you sawed through from the other side, the back cut, until gravity did the rest. The tree would lean, the hinge wood would begin to break, and the whole thing would accelerate toward the ground while the sawyers ran for cover. On a redwood 35 feet in diameter, the crosscut saw had a problem. It could not reach the center. Even a 12-foot blade pulled from one side could only penetrate 6 feet into the trunk. That left 23 feet of solid heartwood completely untouched by the saw. You couldn't cut it from the opposite side either because the blade was already at full extension. You couldn't use 2 saws meeting in the middle because the angles wouldn't work and the kerf would wander. The tree was simply too big for the tool. So the loggers adapted. They developed techniques that no forestry school would recognize today. Techniques born from necessity and refined through failure. Techniques that killed men who got them wrong and made legends of men who got them right. The first adaptation was the springboard. Look at photographs from old-growth logging operations, and you'll notice something strange. The men aren't standing on the ground. They're standing on narrow wooden platforms, jammed into notches they cut into the trunk, 10 or 15 or 20 feet above the forest floor. This wasn't showboating, it was essential. The base of an old-growth redwood flares dramatically outward like the bell of a trumpet. The trunk at ground level might be 40 feet across, but 20 feet up it narrows to a more manageable 30 or 32 feet. Still impossibly large, but less impossible. Still too big for the saw, but closer to being workable. There was another reason to cut high. The base of an old-growth redwood often contained fire scars and rot pockets, defects that would ruin the lumber and make the fall unpredictable. By cutting above the flare, the loggers reached sounder wood and gained better control of the fall direction. Springboards were planks about 4 feet long and 6 inches wide, with a steel tip that jammed into an axe-cut notch in the bark. The notch had to be cut at precisely the right angle. Too steep, and the board would slip out under weight. Too shallow, and it wouldn't seat properly. And getting it right required dozens of practice attempts and a feel for the wood that couldn't be taught from a book. A man would chop the notch, slide the springboard in, test his weight on it carefully, and then stand on this tiny platform while he worked. He would cut another notch higher up, insert another board, and climb to that one. On the largest trees, sawyers might stand on 3 tiers of springboards, 40 feet off the ground, swaying with every movement. The boards flexed and bounced with every motion, which is where the name came from. If you've ever stood on a diving board, you understand the sensation. Now imagine that sensation while swinging an 8-pound axe or pulling a 2-man saw 60 feet off the ground on a platform you cut yourself, in rain or fog or the half-light of early morning. Loggers fell from springboards constantly. Some died. Most just broke bones and went back to work when they healed, because there was no workers' compensation and no paid leave. And if you didn't work, you didn't eat. A broken arm might end your career as a faller, but there was always work bucking logs or driving teams or doing something that paid less but didn't require climbing. But springboards only solved part of the problem. You still had a tree too wide for your saw. The second adaptation was the boring auger. A boring auger was essentially a giant drill bit, 2 or 3 inches in diameter, mounted on a cross handle that 2 men could turn. It was designed to bore straight through wood, creating a cylindrical hole rather than a flat cut. Carpenters used smaller versions for drilling holes in beams. The loggers scaled it up until it could penetrate 30 feet of solid redwood. When a redwood was too large for crosscut saws to reach the center, loggers would use augers to drill through the heartwood from both sides of the trunk. They would bore multiple holes, creating a perforated line that weakened the interior of the tree. Then they would saw the outer sections normally, and the weakened center would break along the line of holes. Picture what this actually means. 2 men standing on springboards, hand cranking a drill, bit through 30 feet of solid redwood, while fog condenses on every surface, and sawdust gums up the mechanism, and their shoulders burn from the repetitive motion. They couldn't see what they were drilling into. They couldn't feel if they were hitting rot or sound wood or a fire scar that would deflect the bit. They just kept boring, hour after hour, hoping that when they finished, the perforations would create a clean breaking point, hoping the bit wouldn't bind so badly that they'd have to abandon it in the tree and start over with another. Sometimes the technique worked. The holes weakened the heartwood just enough. The saw cuts reached deep enough. The tree fell in the direction they'd planned, more or less, and they moved on to the next one. Sometimes it didn't. The holes didn't align. The heartwood was stronger than expected. The tree twisted on the stump and fell sideways, crushing equipment and sometimes men, wasting weeks of work in seconds. The auger technique worked. Barely. But it was slow and physically brutal even by logging standards. A single tree might require dozens of auger holes before it was weak enough to finish with saws and wedges. Each hole took hours to bore. Each hole meant 2 men cranking until their arms trembled, and the trees still didn't fall cleanly. This is where the butcher technique came in. When you fell a normal tree, you're trying to drop it in one piece, in a predictable direction. You control the fall by cutting a notch on the side where you want it to go, then sawing through from the back until the tree tips into the notch and gravity pulls it down. A skilled faller can drop a tree into a gap between 2 others, threading a needle that seemed impossible from the ground. On old-growth redwoods, this precision was often impossible. The trunks were too thick, the internal structure too unpredictable, the sheer mass too great for clean technique. A tree that weighed 4 million pounds didn't tip gracefully. It wrenched itself from its own base, tearing fibers, twisting as it fell, responding to forces that the sawyers couldn't see or predict. So loggers developed what they called the butcher approach. Rather than felling the tree whole, they would hack it apart in stages, accepting destruction as the price of getting the wood out. First, they'd cut a bed. This was a layer of smaller logs and branches laid on the ground where the tree would land, designed to cushion the impact. Building a proper bed might take a day or more. Workers would drag in logs from previous fells, arrange them in a thick cushion, add branches to fill the gaps. Without a bed, the redwood would shatter when it hit the earth, the impact exploding the trunk into splinters, destroying massive amounts of usable lumber. Even with a bed, the impact was catastrophic. A tree falling from 300 feet hit the ground with enough force to register on seismographs. The cushion helped, but it couldn't prevent all damage. Then they'd begin the felling cuts, working from their springboards, sawing and augering until the tree started to lean. They used massive iron wedges driven into the saw cuts with sledgehammers to control the direction of the lean. Some wedges weighed 20 pounds. Driving them required a coordination between the wedge man and the sawyers that could mean the difference between a controlled fall and a disaster. The wedge man stood on his own springboard behind the sawyers, watching the cut for signs of movement. When the kerf started to close, pinching the saw, he'd drive a wedge in to hold it open. When the tree started to lean, he'd drive more wedges to tip it in the right direction. One wrong stroke could send the tree the wrong way. One slipped wedge could pinch the saw so badly the sawyers couldn't pull it out. And when the tree finally went, it didn't go cleanly. The trunk often twisted as it fell, pulling fibers apart rather than breaking along the cut line. The impact split sections of the trunk lengthwise, turning solid wood into fractured slabs. Branches exploded on contact with the ground, sending shrapnel in every direction. The sound was described as apocalyptic by those who heard it. A deep groaning as the tree began to move, the sound of 3,000 years of growth beginning to fail. Then an accelerating crack as the hinge wood gave way and the trunk began its descent. Then a rising roar of wind through the branches, building to a shriek as the tree accelerated past any speed it had ever known. Then the crash. The crash registered on seismographs. It shook the earth for miles. It could be heard from ridge lines 2 or 3 miles distant, a sound like thunder without lightning, like an explosion without fire. Men who heard it for the first time never forgot it. Men who heard it every day for years still stopped to watch. Loggers working nearby would stop and watch, not out of sentimentality, out of self-preservation. A falling redwood created shockwaves through the forest floor that could knock a man off his feet. Branches that had hung stable for centuries would drop from adjacent trees, their support suddenly disturbed. The air would fill with dust and bark and debris that took minutes to settle. After the fall, what remained was devastation. A trench in the earth where the tree had landed, a crater where the stump still stood, surrounded by torn roots and upheaved soil, a path of destruction through the forest, where the crown had swept smaller trees aside like brushing crumbs from a table. And then the work of processing began. Here's the part that's hardest to accept. After all that work, after 2 weeks of sawing and augering and wedging, after risking lives and spending wages and coordinating crews, they wasted up to 50% of every tree. Not through carelessness, through physics. The butcher technique, by its nature, destroyed wood. The twisted fall, the shattering impact, the explosive breaking of fibers that couldn't be cut cleanly. All of it meant that massive sections of each redwood ended up as debris rather than lumber. The flared base, too thick to transport, was left in the forest to rot. Buckers, the men who sawed fallen trees into manageable lengths, would simply cut off the first 20 feet and leave it where it lay. That section alone might contain more usable wood than an entire old-growth Douglas fir. But moving it was impossible with the technology available. Sections that split on impact became firewood at best, waste at worst. Cracks ran deep into the heartwood, rendering it unusable for anything structural. You couldn't sell cracked lumber, and you couldn't hide the cracks. Branches the size of mature oaks in any other forest were burned where they fell because no one could move them. Picture this: a branch 8 feet in diameter, 100 feet long, containing enough wood to build a house, and they set it on fire because dragging it out would cost more than it was worth. The fires burned for days, sometimes weeks. The slash piles smoldered, filling the canyons with smoke, turning the fog acrid and yellow. On bad days, you couldn't see 100 feet in front of your face. On good days, you could just make out the silhouettes of the trees you'd be cutting next. And the stumps. My God, the stumps. Visit old logging sites in Humboldt County today, and you'll find stumps 20 feet across, still visible after 130 years. The wood resists rot so effectively that the stumps will be there for another 100 years, maybe 200, slowly decaying, while second-growth redwoods sprout around them. Some stumps have been used as dance floors. I mean that literally. In the 1920s and 1930s, people would hold square dances on redwood stumps, the flat surface large enough for a dozen couples. Others have trees growing out of them, second-growth redwoods sprouting from the decayed interior of their ancestors, drawing nutrients from the body of the tree that preceded them. The stumps are memorials, accidental monuments to everything that was taken. Each one represents 50% waste, 50% usable lumber, and 100% of something that can never be replaced. Because here's the thing about old-growth redwoods. They cannot be replanted. They cannot be regrown. A tree that took 3,000 years to reach maturity cannot be replaced by a seedling, no matter how many seedlings you plant. Where second-growth redwoods exist, they grow fast by tree standards, reaching harvestable size in 50 to 70 years. but they are not the same organism as their ancestors. They don't have the tight grain, the fire resistance, the sheer mass. A second-growth redwood might be 60 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter. An old-growth redwood was 300 feet tall and 35 feet in diameter. They are children playing at being giants. The old growth is gone, 96% of it, a race between 1850 and 1960. After the trees fell, after the butchering was done, after the waste was burned and the stumps were left to rot, the usable lumber had to get to market. This was almost as dangerous as the felling itself. The logs were too big for wagons. A single log might weigh 50,000 pounds, far beyond what any team of horses or oxen could pull on wheels. So the loggers built what they called skid roads. Skid roads were paths cut through the forest, lined with half-buried logs laid crosswise like railroad ties. A log to be moved would be chained to a team of oxen, sometimes 12 or 16 animals working together, and dragged along the skid road to the mill or the river. The cross logs reduced friction, sort of, and kept the main log from digging into the earth, sort of. The men who drove the ox teams were called bullwhackers, and they walked alongside their animals with whips and prods, and a vocabulary of profanity that could curdle milk. The oxen were often injured. So were the bullwhackers. A chain snapping under tension would cut a man in half. A log shifting sideways would crush anything in its path. When steam power arrived, they replaced the oxen with steam donkeys, massive engines that wound cables around drums. The cables ran through pulleys high in the trees, creating a system that could drag logs across terrain, too rough for animals. The steam donkeys were faster than oxen, more powerful, and even more dangerous. A snapped cable under that much tension became a whip that could decapitate anyone within 100 feet. The logs went to mills along the rivers and the coast. There they were, sawn into boards, sorted by grade, and shipped to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, to markets around the world. The same wood that had stood for 3,000 years in the fog became siding on houses in Denver, shingles on roofs in Chicago, railroad ties that crossed the continent. The timeline of destruction is staggering when you lay it out. In 1850, approximately 2 million acres of old-growth coast redwoods stood in California. No roads penetrated most of this forest, no mills operated within it. The trees had survived fire and drought and flood for millennia, and they had done so without human intervention. By 1900, logging had cleared significant portions of Humboldt County. Mills operated along every navigable waterway. Railroads snaked into valleys that had never heard machinery. The largest trees were the most valuable, and they fell first. By 1930, mechanization accelerated the harvest. Steam donkeys replaced mule teams for dragging logs. Narrow-gauge railways reached deeper into the backcountry. Chainsaws were invented, though they wouldn't become practical for another 20 years. The pace of cutting tripled, then quadrupled. By 1960, it was essentially over. The big trees were gone. The mills that remained switched to second-growth timber, which grew back fast enough to harvest sustainably, but offered none of the quality that had made redwood famous. Today, approximately 120,000 acres of old-growth coast redwoods remain. That's 6% of the original 2 million. Most of it survives in parks, preserved after decades of activism by people who recognize that some things, once destroyed, stay destroyed. Redwood National and State Parks. Humboldt Redwood State Park, Muir Woods. These are the refuges where you can still walk among trees that watch civilizations rise and fall. But they are fragments, islands in a sea of second growth and clear cuts, and vineyards and suburban development. The contiguous forest that once ran unbroken from Big Sur to Oregon exists now only in photographs and memory. What was lost cannot be calculated in board feet. The wood itself was remarkable. Redwood lumber resists rot, resists insects, resists fire. It weathers to a silver gray that improves with age. Victorian homes built from old-growth redwood still stand, their siding intact after 150 years. You can see the tight grain, The vertical lines pack so close together that a magnifying glass reveals details invisible to the naked eye. But the wood was the least of it. What was lost was an ecosystem. Old-growth redwood forests were not just trees. They were communities. Spotted owls nested in the upper canopy, requiring the complex structure that only old trees provided. Salmon spawned in streams shaded by redwood groves, their runs timed to the precise water temperatures that the forest maintained. Marbled murrelets, seabirds that inexplicably nested 50 miles inland, raised their chicks in the moss-covered branches of ancient trees. When the trees fell, these species lost their habitat, not diminished, lost. Salmon runs collapsed without stream shade. The water warmed, the oxygen levels dropped, the fish died or stopped coming. Owl populations crashed without nesting sites. The murrelets, still endangered today, never recovered. The forest floor communities vanished too. Salamanders that lived nowhere else. Fungi that had evolved alongside the redwoods for millions of years. Plants that required the specific conditions of old-growth shade, the filtered light, the deep duff of accumulated needles. And something else was lost. Something harder to quantify, but just as real. We lost the chance to stand beneath something genuinely ancient. We lost the opportunity to feel small in a way that modern life rarely permits. We lost cathedrals of wood and fog that made every human structure look temporary by comparison. I am not saying that logging should never have happened. Lumber built cities. Lumber built ships. Lumber built the infrastructure of a growing nation. Men needed work, families needed income, and the trees were standing there, converting capital on the stump into wages and dividends and economic growth. But there should have been limits. There should have been restraint. There should have been someone somewhere who said, leave some, leave enough, leave the oldest ones at least. Sure, it's because we will never see their like again. No one said it. Or rather, some said it, but not enough, and not loudly enough, and not soon enough. By the time preservation movements gained political power, 90% of the damage was done. The men who cut these trees are mostly forgotten now. Their names don't appear in history books. Their photographs, when they exist, show anonymous figures dwarfed by logs the size of locomotives. They were immigrants and migrants, men whose English was sometimes limited, whose formal education was sometimes non-existent, whose only legacy was the absence of what they cut. This is not fair to them. They did extraordinary work under extraordinary conditions. They developed techniques that engineers today would struggle to replicate. They risked their lives daily for wages that barely covered living expenses, and they did it all without complaint, or at least without complaint that anyone recorded. I think about the faller standing on his springboard, 20 feet up, arms burning from hours of sawing, looking at a tree so wide he cannot see around it. I think about what it must have felt like to know that you were ending something truly ancient, something that was alive before your ancestors had language. Did they feel anything? Did they pause? Probably not. Probably they were too tired, too hungry, too focused on the immediate problem of not dying that day. Philosophical reflection is a luxury for people with job security and full stomachs. But I wonder if sometimes, late at night, in bunkhouses that smelled of sweat and sawdust, one logger would turn to another and say, "That tree was old. That tree was really old. And I cut it down." What would the other logger say? Would he laugh? Would he agree? Would he point out that Rome wasn't built from good intentions? That progress requires sacrifice? That a tree is just a tree no matter how long it stood? I don't know. I'll never know. The men who could tell me are dead. And they didn't leave diaries. And even if they had, their diaries would have been in Swedish or Portuguese, and no historian would have bothered to translate them. What I know is this: they were human beings doing human work. They were not monsters. They were not heroes. They were labor, applied to resources, in the service of markets they didn't control and couldn't predict. And when the last of them died, probably sometime in the 1950s or 1960s, they took with them knowledge that no book can replace. The feel of bark under an axe blade, the sound of a saw hitting rot, the specific angle of a springboard that means safety versus one that means death. Today, if you want to understand what old-growth logging looked like, you have to piece it together from fragments. Museums in Eureka and Arcata display crosscut saws with teeth the size of your thumb. Interpretive centers show grainy photographs of men standing on stumps they could barely walk across. State parks maintain sections of fallen old growth, trees that toppled naturally, so visitors can see the sheer scale of what was harvested. But scale is hard to convey in photographs. Scale requires presence. You have to stand at the base of a surviving old-growth redwood, tilt your head back until your neck hurts, follow the trunk up and up until it disappears into fog, and then imagine two men with hand tools spending 2 weeks cutting through it. You have to walk through second-growth forest, trees 60 or 80 years old that look perfectly mature by normal standards, and then step into an old-growth grove and realize that the second-growth trees are children, saplings, adolescents at best. You have to find an old stump, one of the big ones, and try to count the rings. Your finger will cramp before you reach the center. Your eyes will lose track. You'll give up around 800 rings and realize you're not even close to the middle. That's what they cut. That's what they wasted. That's what they turned into railroad ties and fence posts and shingle siding for houses that burned down or fell down or were demolished for parking lots decades ago. I want to end by standing in one of the remaining old-growth groves, not physically. I'm recording this in a studio. But mentally, imaginatively, I want to be there. The air is different in old-growth forest. Cooler, damper, scented with tannins and decay, and the particular smell of redwood bark, which is almost spicy, almost like cinnamon, but not quite. The fog filters light into something gray and soft and ancient. Sound doesn't carry the same way it does in open country. The trees absorb everything, muffle everything, create a silence that feels earned rather than empty. And the trees themselves. Standing among them is not like standing among other trees. It is closer to standing among mountains or ruins, or something built by forces you cannot comprehend. They don't seem like plants. They seem like architecture, like monuments, like evidence of time, evidence of possibility, evidence that life, given enough years, can achieve something that seems impossible. And we cut most of it down. We cut it down for money, for employment, for building materials, for reasons that seemed compelling at the time and seem monstrous in hindsight. We took something that took 3,000 years to grow and turned it into sawdust in an afternoon. And we did it with hand tools, two-man saws, boring augers, iron wedges, springboards cut from the very trees being destroyed. The men who did this work deserve better than to be forgotten. The trees they destroyed deserve better than to become stumps. And we, the inheritors of both their labor and their loss, deserve to understand what was done in our name, with our resources for our benefit. 6% remains. 120,000 acres scattered across parks and preserves, protected by laws that arrived too late to protect most of what mattered. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something. It is evidence. It is a place where you can still stand beneath something that watched empires rise and fall, and feel exactly how small you are, and understand exactly what we lost when we decided that nothing was too big to cut down. Go there, if you can. Stand there. Feel the bark under your hand. Tilt your head back until your neck aches. And remember that two men with a crosscut saw could have felled the tree you're standing beneath, would have felled it if someone hadn't said stop, would have turned 3,000 years of continuous life into lumber and sawdust and stumps. That's the story of old-growth redwood logging, not a story of villains, not a story of heroes, a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary work for ordinary reasons and erasing something that can never be replaced. 96% gone. That's the number that matters. 96% gone, and the chainsaws hadn't even been invented yet. If you made it this far, you understand something that most people never consider. You understand that the lumber in old Victorian homes came from somewhere, that the somewhere was alive, that the alive thing was ancient beyond comprehension, and that the men who cut it down were just as trapped by their circumstances as the trees were rooted by theirs. Subscribe if this is the kind of history you want to understand. Not the sanitized version, not the version where progress comes free, The version where progress has a price, and the price is paid by workers and forests and communities that never asked to be part of someone else's equation. Next time, we'll look at another industry that transformed America by destroying what made it possible. Another story of men and machines and things that can't be brought back. Until then, remember the Redwoods. Remember what they were. Remember what we did. And remember that 6% still stands, waiting for you to visit, waiting for you to understand,